Thank you so much for all coming. It's cold outside, and it's downtown. I was just telling Ottessa, who I've had an amazing pleasure of getting to know because of this talk. We've had some occasions of meeting and talking, silent phone, that I'm finding it really hard today to do this because today, and I just want to share that with you guys too, because usually my energy is a bit different. But today, well, you know, I'm from Iran, and I'm sure many of you have seen what's happening in Iran right now. And today was one of the first days that they started, that the Iranian regime started to execute political prisoners. And so, what is there to talk about? It sort of stifles one's actions. So we'll talk about that. I'm sure it'll come up just because it's there, and just because I have an occasion, I will ask if you guys can just keep your eye on it, because we live in a world of eyes make a difference, because now we can have eyes. But we'll talk more about it. But because you've also come here, we will also talk about other things, just so that your time is well served. But go on.
Okay.
Ottessa, you now. Yes, thank you.
Well, should we just talk? I wanted to.
Definitely. Before we do this, is there any way we could take the sound out of for our talk, because the sound is going to be constant? Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay.
Can I talk about your history, where you come from? You're coming to it?
I'm
okay, you're going
to
it.
that.
Sorry, yes, this is going to be how that goes, yeah.
So I got this text when I was in the bathroom. Tess, this is from my mother. Tess, Dad just told me about your conversation. Please be careful and don't get provoked and engage in any political discussion. Please. So
that's correct. That's a generational difference, isn't it? And that's a very, I'm sure that's a very, but go on, you were saying.
I mean, I'm curious. Well, first of all, I should preface that with that my mother is not Iranian. She's Croatian, and she lived in Iran and left Iran in 1979. So she might be familiar with some of the dangers of political opinions.
Yeah.
I mean, Croatia has its own history, obviously. But I'm curious, how safe do you feel?
Oh, I feel extremely safe. I live in Los Angeles. I feel safe. People are not safe. I am safe. There has to be a definite, clear distinction of the safeties that I'm able to enjoy, and thereby, use your mic. You know, like there is a responsibility that goes with that. It's interesting, you know. Yeah, we live in a safe place. This is true. Painting has become impossible in the last 3-4 months. Because for me it seemed that when the ashes are cold and when there is no action, painting can start to work, and you can start thinking and start making things to in fact start fires, to in fact warm the ashes, to in fact. But when there is movement, when there is a revolutionary instinct, when there is motion, it feels like the art thing can be a distraction from it. That in fact it can, and that is in many forms, right? That in fact it can kind of use that energy it can instead of funneling that energy into an action that's actually nuts and bolts and actual action, it releases that energy in a way that doesn't result necessarily in an immediate action, which is what sometimes revolutionary moments need. Which is, interestingly though, not true for music. I would say not all art forms, and maybe music has a very immediate reaction and maybe an immediate response to one's strings to different actions.
It's really easy to manipulate people with music because you don't really have to think.
It works with you.
Yeah.
It's intimate. Yeah.
Do you think that as an artist you have a moral responsibility to make your art about things that other people are talking about, things that are happening?
I think one of the only values of art is that it could be totally useless. I mean, I think a moral imperative doesn't come from good art that does do something, does it not because it's felt an obligation to do so, but because it's coming from somewhere that then responds to somebody else's feeling, etc. And then to have an expectation of that, maybe for some people, I don't know, like Dickens writes, right? Dickens' books probably shaped my, philosophy and way of life. I don't know.
Like
probably.
Anyone in particular?
Well, in Iran, there were these abbreviated versions of all of Dickens' books, but like for the 12-year-old, for the 10-year-old, right? So like Les Miserables and all of the sort of, the big ones you would read, and it made a huge imprint, right? But I mean, I don't think he felt a moral obligation to write the things he was writing. But who's to say? You might know better.
I honestly don't know what he was thinking.
Yeah.
I think he was looking at the world around him and was fascinated by it, and saw stories that were worthy of telling, that had some virtues.
Yeah.
And were also very entertaining.
I think that to look around and find your curiosity is a more productive way of being than finding it as an obligation. But just so that people like maybe who are makers think about it, like right at the moment of the pandemic, I'm not sure, but for me it was another moment of like, what do I do now? What do I make now? What is our world? Where do we live in now? What is going to be after this? And this is similar to that, where it feels like this is such an unknown thing. There's nothing to respond to. I have to first understand it. But this is also when you wrote Lapvona, is when you...
Lapvona, yeah. I was just home also, not responding. Because I was just stuck at home like everybody else, and knew that I needed to write a novel. I can't say that I felt like I needed to write a novel about the experience of a global pandemic, but I knew that it was an opportunity. There was like this sounds so egotistical, but I was gifted this container, and like, what do? You use it.
Container of time.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
So I knew I needed a project, and I also knew that I needed to shift the way that I thought about narrative, because the world had I felt like the world was ending. I mean, we were never going to be the same, so I knew that I needed to never, not like I was making it as a conscious choice, but I knew I would never be the same. And part of the shift was in moving from first-person I narrative into a third-person narrative, and thinking for the first time about how to describe a community, because my characters had previously been just storytellers about themselves and their own experiences, almost like a monologue self-portrait. And I just really didn't feel like that was appropriate, but like just for my own psychology, to be stuck in one character. Interesting. Yeah. But I wanted to talk, a lot of people, well, I don't know, a lot of people, but there's this term happening in the literary world these days, and it's autofiction. And, people have been writing autobiographical fiction, and the term has kind of taken on, for me anyway, this like weird way of describing first-person narrative that is personal. I mean, and it's very easy as a reader to ascribe the whatever qualities of this character that you're reading onto the author. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about you versus the painter of that. Like, you know, I'm author, and then there's a narrator. What is your version of that?
Oh, that's interesting. Author, narrator, and then the artwork, the artifact, the maker. I'm so sorry for everyone who's standing. If you get tired, you can also sit here. But that's how kind of I relate. I distract from the object. I have a very detached relationship to my work. I make it, I'm very present during the making of it, but the minute it's finished, my relationship to it is rather finished. I almost like it from the periphery. When I look at it now, I might think, oh my God, somebody did this. And I don't have that presence of, it might be a personality disorder if you guys are psychoanalytic. I'm not defining myself, but this is my experience of a slight detachment. Not during, again, but it's also a condition of the fact that I also paint very fast, perhaps. We were talking about this, about how when you're working on one piece, the duration of that, the presence of that, the fact that you have to linger in that world for as long with all the characters, again, and the reread and the re-edit and the staying over and over is such a different process. In a way that happens, perhaps with the way I work too, but across works. So maybe thematically it goes around and around, but not on a singular piece. I've seen interviews with you though where people are saying this is that you do like this is very personal to me. But then in the description, it's also, there's a respect of a detachment, that they don't really think it's sort of, what's the word, like it's not confessional, right, in a sense, that it is made. Whereas people, a lot of times when people look at paintings, they do really think it's, like, so you shit, Mo, sort of, that's you, right? And so it's an interesting maybe experience we have when we read novels, because we project ourselves maybe much stronger onto it. But we're experiencing paintings or artworks maybe as somebody else's experience, perhaps, and not allowing ourselves to be in it as much, perhaps. It's also maybe because our physical location for experiencing those things are entirely different. One is intimate, maybe in your bed. One is in a public institution, maybe somebody else's house, whatever. I'm not sure where this is going, but... Well,
I'm curious on the subject of personality disorders and shit mom. What is your relationship with the field of psychology?
God. Oof. I mean, I don't know as much as I should or would like to. There's no should. I love Adam Phillips' writings, who's a very readable psychoanalyst in Britain, who's written very many books. I think he makes 2 books a year or something. I'm kidding. But I mean, I've read all the. I think it's so present in our culture. Like Freud and psychoanalysis is so present in the way that we read things. So I use it. I guess I use it more than putting myself in a particular sort of state with it. But yeah, can I ask you the same?
My relationship, I hate psychology.
But your character was so brilliant. I mean, in my year in Relaxation, the character psychoanalyst was such a, I mean, she should quite get her license revoked, but yeah.
Yeah, well, psychiatry and psychology,
Oh,
there's a
different
distinction
things. This is
there.
my relationship to that. There you go. Now you know the answer. Yeah, yeah.
No, I mean, I think I've always, I'm like, you know, the kind of person who's like, if there's a system, I know I should hate it. Right. So the school of psychology that breaks down human feelings and behaviors into these pathologies, you know, I'm like, okay, I must resist that. And yet, you know, pop psychology is just, it's part of our everyday experience. And, you know, I talk a lot about boundaries and things like that. So I think psychology is definitely something that we're all doing. Like, we're all studying the science of how people work. I mean, maybe, no, not all of us, but I feel like artists are.
Well, involuntary, you have to deal with your neighbor, you have to think about how they work. Otherwise
Neighbors, for sure.
But, yeah. But, you know, I think we do live in a moment of probably, who's to judge, but what is it? The greatest, not an anxiety, but whatever creates an anxiety, apprehension. Like, we're so terrified, right, of, aren't we?
Probably.
Just me.
It's a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
I want to know, when you're painting, when you're painting your male figures.
No.
What?
Nothing, go on.
Like, how, like, are you laughing? Are you smiling? Do you feel, how, like, what does it feel like?
This is actually quite true. I do paint in a quite an exuberant, happy way that I paint. And this is also why I've not been able to paint in the last 3 months, because my energy has been, so I started painting post 9/11 in a way that I showed. And so my paintings were always implicated with my own personal position, with my own, you know, personal, and at the same time filtering or realizing or thinking about my experience and my audience as a Western audience and their experiences of the work. And so it was sort of, there's this tension between a critique that I may be holding and also another critique that I'm holding about a viewership that has its own prejudices. So that's now all very complicated with where we are right now. Because, you know, as you can imagine, the left is finding itself in a difficult crossroad where it wants to be, let's say, critical of the Islamic government of Iran. At the same time, it's really afraid of seeming Islamophobic. So it's finding its language really hard. It's having a hard time with its language. Similarly, companies and governments, companies that might have come to the forefront of Black Lives Matter are finding it hard, thinking, but we don't want to seem like we're just jumping on the bandwagon of, let's say, women life freedom because we just want to get your clicks and your business. So there's sort of the sort of canceling of action by the left because of wanting not to do the wrong thing is a real big problem. And that also filters in, I think, artists and writer studios of, oops, I don't want to be told, I don't want to make the wrong step. What if I don't know everything about this before I maybe make a statement that seems like what I should be saying? And so we have to find a solution about that too, because there are a lot of people making a lot of statements, right? So if the left cancels its own position, I mean, I don't want to tell you, God, that, we're not going to talk about Trump. So, okay, we won't talk about Trump. Sorry, this is that kind of talk tonight. Ottessa, please go. But no,
go.
Yeah, go. No, not go. No, but you deal with the same thing. I mean, self-censorship, in a sense, or getting it wrong. How do you deal with that?
Well, I was just telling someone that I do my research strictly through osmosis. So like I buy a lot of books about a subject and then I just like rub them on me.
I take that very seriously. I actually would think that could be quite, I mean, that's, yeah.
I mean, I think there's, when you talked about the distraction, I really relate to that because I actually think if I'm focusing too much on something, it's going to get very dumb. And my imagination works best when I'm focusing on something else, usually something stupid. So like, I don't know why this is true about me, but when I was writing Lapvona, which is a novel about like a year in a medieval village and like a big cast of characters and a lot of really fucked up stuff happens. I found that like I would do kind of like that game where you close your eyes and put your finger on the globe whenever I was like, I need information. And I would kind of like flip through a book and it felt like this amazing psychic moment because I would find exactly what I was looking for. Obviously, I'm actually just like, you know, picking breadcrumbs and making pie. But what was your question? How do I...
But that's great. Let's just go with that. Forget the question.
I mean, how do I do... I don't know why I started talking about research.
But I would love to talk about Lapvona, and I always have dyslexic when I say that, so don't take my word for it.
Self-censorship. That's what you were talking about. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm like a very... I try, like, I feel like I have to censor myself in like, don't write something boring rather than don't write something upsetting. Because there's no, don't write something upsetting is assuming that I understand the sensitivities of others, which to me feels like a very arrogant assumption. Or, oh no, they couldn't handle this, assuming that everybody's just a bunch of babies. When actually, when I look around, people really love things like violence, torture, rape. It's everywhere. It's in every story. I mean, even like you look at like White Lotus, you know, everybody's so crazy about White Lotus. That's actually very upsetting.
Class warfare. I mean, this is, everybody got, everybody who didn't have money got...
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, tastes and fashion and style are, you know, some people are paid to predict these things. I'm not. So if I write a book today, it's going to be published a year from now. And a year from now, the world could be a very different place. So if I'm making decisions about what stories and how I want to tell them based on what people are saying they're upset about, I'm really setting myself up to write something boring that should have come out 3 years before.
Yeah, and also, I mean, to some extent, it's also just very distracting. I mean, we were also talking about not consuming a lot of contemporary information sometimes when you want to make something, and so that you can actually be a little bit more clear-headed about what your position is on something. Perhaps. Yeah.
I also wonder, do you have to resist having a position in order to make more interesting art?
I mean, I have a lot of positions. I sadly can't not have a position on something. But painting doesn't work that way, which is good in a way. The painting maybe itself saves sometimes. I mean, people, if you think that you're clarifying a position with a painting will tell you, no, I'm a painting, and I can't do that for you, so stop. So painting itself is not the clarity that words allow, language allows, that it can allow. Painting is an tactile object, visceral. with a visual language that, you read things based on what you've seen in everybody's individual history of all the paintings they've seen in their life. So your read of anything is like affected by everything that you've seen, and how that's sort of cumulatively made your eyes sensitive to receive that information. So I think painting specifically really works in the canon of its own history, and so meaning is really derived from each drip. Like drips have meanings. Haha. The end. Oh, I don't have my book. No, I'll stop.
I'm curious. I mean, when I write, I'm using a keyboard. I mean, you're using a way more sensitive instrument when you're painting with a paintbrush.
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah.
And but I think about this a lot. It's probably really dumb, but when I think about the mechanics of the keyboard, and I studied piano when I was young, and I had a piano teacher, and a keyboard of a piano is also a mechanical system. There, you push something, a lever is done, dong, blah blah blah. Not a scientist, but. She always told me, people think this, you just press it, but actually this is very sensitive. And she taught me different ways of touching it, the key. And sometimes I feel like if I'm writing when I'm making a certain expression, or I'm holding myself a certain way, or I'm turning my head a certain way, the word, even though it's the same word, will have just a different spirit. It will land differently. I mean, that could just be like completely insane.
I don't think so. I think it's accurate, because I think it's about rhythm. It's about the rhythm of your thinking is being affected by your idea of touch, and by your idea of changing that touch to whatever, to the keyboard, to the floor, to the chair. And it's the thinking that's creating the words. And it's the thinking that's creating the painting too, right? So like, whatever it is, even if it's about auto painting or something, that's still the thought that I'm going to make auto painting, so go. So I think it's absolutely accurate. And I do think that your books do have a very particular rhythm, actually, in first-person or third-person narrative. I mean, voice, that you were saying. Yeah.
How is your, just ask a technical question. You seem to be working in paint, some silkscreen, and then animation. What comes first, like your impulse to use a certain material, or the concept and imagery, or how do you decide these things?
Well, at different times, differently. Right now, for instance, since nothing is coming, there's nothing. I'll probably, if I want to go back to work, I'll start with just a sketchbook, and there'll be nothing, and the sketches will be terrible. They'll be awful. And then I'll realize that I've forgotten how to draw because I've been painting so much. So you see those pictures of people who are always drawing, and it works. Your hand becomes better at just moving, and if you don't, you just don't. So at the moment, because I know there's nothing, it'll be laboriously trying to figure something of interest. But like you were saying, I'll until something feels exciting, feels like if it makes me laugh a couple times, then that's something to file. Or if it makes me excited or embarrassed or ashamed, or because I think some of the stuff you were saying, it's also about processing. So you don't want to run away from the difficult. Because as a society, we need to process these things. I think when you were saying that we have interest in these macabre things like X, Y, and Z, it's also because we need to process them, because they are they've hit us. So you can't just stand there being slapped. You need to deal with it. And making work is a way of understanding things. Yeah, but then sometimes when things are happening, it can just be an image. Mom was an accident. She came accidentally when I was trying to wipe something off. and I just saw a muddy female figure next to a pristine child figure. I was like, oh shit, Mom, where have you been? And I was like, I'm sure I've seen it somewhere. And I realized I hadn't, but so yeah.
Does that happen to you a lot where you're like, oh, this must exist?
Oh, no, because it's not that I care that much about that. You know, I mean, I think everything, if it's got a use value for me, I'll use it. I'm not interested in, like, making something new. I'm just interested in having a very direct experience or a thought, you know, about something. That would be too much of a, you know, expectation.
You answered not the question I thought I was asking, but the question that came out. And I guess what I was actually asking was, does it happen to you a lot that you think of something that is your original concept, like shit, Mom, and think this must already exist? Or is it, because I think there's something so uncanny about your work where I'm like, really? Oh, I've seen that. I know I haven't seen it before, but I feel like I have.
Well, I'll say Shit Mom was probably the only thing that maybe hadn't existed before. And of course it did verbally. I mean, we all talk about our shit moms, right? So, but like, you know, the paintings that I've painted, I've drawn them out of a stereotypical image. A caricaturized image that's existed for centuries, probably, you know, for different... I mean, you know, if you look at comic books, there's a great book called the Encyclopedia of Supervillains, you know, and exaggerations and, you know, sort of whoever was a villain in the 70s or the 40s or during World War II or during World War I. It's interesting, caricaturizing different... so I think Shimon was probably singular in that experience. Otherwise, everything exists, yeah.
I'm just curious what you think the supervillain is now. What are their characteristics?
That's such a good one. We can have a whole weekend sort of like workshop about that, but also we should. I mean, that's great. Let's sit with that for a second. Supervillains. By the way, this is open. I think this is such a good question. It's open to the audience, I think. So throw it out if you know. I mean, I feel like the first thing is I would talk about self-censorship is this person can't have a gender, or an ethnicity, any kind of. You mean self-censorship as the villain?
Self-censorship as the creator.
Oh, interesting. Like the censoring body as a creator of something very narrow.
I'm like, okay, maybe we're coming at this from different points of view, because obviously. I'm like, okay, if I had to create a supervillain, that's such a commercial character that I'm already. I mean, maybe I'm making assumptions about villains, but like, well, it's a comic book, so this has to be like safe for mass consumption. Also, it's going to be sold at a drugstore. So, you know, it will fail if at any point I've upset a group of people who will, you know, then complain to the body that either creates it or distributes it. So then it will cease to exist. So I'm like, okay, supervillain.
Oh, interesting. Well, I was thinking about what are we all finding problems with collectively, and that would be the supervillain. Like, what is the thing that's like, that's sort of upsetting or disrupting the biggest number of people, and that's the supervillain. That's how I would sort of. I wouldn't know that it's definitely a comic book, or it's definitely going to that. Like, you know what I mean? I was just thinking about it in general of like our day's supervillain. I have a list. Amassing public opinion, as a force that's sort of problematic. You know, yeah, God, where do we start? Just fear or go on. Supervillains.
I mean, I don't know.
Lack of.
I like characters.
But this is amazing that because you make the most interesting characters. No, but not as an empty compliment, but as someone who's, I'm just thinking about how does, when something is, how do I put this in a form of a question? It's very interesting to me. When I first met you, I said, I can imagine as a writer, your use value for observation must be so acute because you can sort of look and say, oh, that's, and then I'm gonna, that's a character. That's who I've been looking for. Whereas I really can't do that in painting. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe some artists can, but I don't do that in painting. The use value of people that my personal space is nothing for my work. It's all in the head. It's very interior. So character. But
so you don't think that your observations influence your creative output? Not
as broadly as what I do observe in life, in a very narrow way.
I can't imagine that.
Yeah.
What is the inside of your mind like?
Problematized.
Like, really?
Yeah.
What, does it have any architecture?
Not in painting, but in dreams, yeah. But not in painting, obviously. I can't draw space. Disclaimer. Yeah. And that's also good. If you can't do something, you don't have to,
No, you have to do that. That's the one thing you have to do.
Yeah. Should we open it up to questions, by the way? I think our time is... Please, if you need a mic, do we need a mic for the recorder, or should we just... Or you can also speak very loudly. I know there are a lot of Ottessa fans here, so please ask very detailed, deep literary questions. Please.
You were talking about this, but I just kind of wanted to go back to it, which is, I do a lot of different things. I don't have a specific medium, if you will, but... Hello. I was wondering, is your art a way of processing, or do you need to have processed it, the concept, the character, before you make it or as you make it? Because I think about that a lot, because sometimes I spend way too much time planning, and I'm like, I just need to go for this, and I guess it's an even bigger question of looking at the creative process as play or, the next great American novel, or this needs to be at the Met, that kind of pressure in the process of making, in terms of how much of that do you think needs to be processed? And this is obviously a personal question for both of you, just in both forms of your work. I'm just interested.
You want to start? I like to think that I allow myself both, that I kind of allow some space in the studio for play, and allow space in the studio for, if you are really processing something, you probably don't know that you're processing it. It's not like, okay, now I'm going to process, right? But I was just saying that the attraction towards the things that are, whatever they are, whatever you want to say, heavy or whatever, is that I would say there's a social need for them. But it's also interesting because I think, for me, I do kind of go back and forth a lot of being aware that I'm doing something, and I'm also aware of how would I see it as an audience. So there's a back and forth, and then thinking, I don't like the aftertaste of this. And so I'm going to shift it. So you experience something as a maker, and that's one thing. But then you also are aware of the kind of aftertaste that you want to leave, and that also allows you to pivot. Someone said art is one's creative response to one's life or reality, and I think the idea of leaning into that idea of it's a creative response and allowing that to actually be a creative response as opposed to a one-on-one is the thing that actually saves you and makes something. It's sort of, that translation into something that is then magical. Thoughts?
Interesting.
Go on.
You're an interesting person.
Oh, no.
No, I guess my reaction to the processing thing is like, I don't like processing anything actively. Like, I don't even really like talking. And I prefer to exist. Like, I prefer my life to be like the sideshow and to really just exist in my imagined creative spaces, which is a problem. I mean, it's not a problem for me, it's a problem for everyone else that has a relationship with me. So I think I'm probably processing everything in that space, which is probably why it's so disturbing to some people, because I'm doing me not in a polite way, but I don't know how else to do it. So.
Go ahead.
Oh, do you want? Okay. Hi, I wanted to, I don't know, either rephrase or offer a different perspective or comment on the supervillain
Please.
question earlier. And I guess I was thinking about, I think the best supervillains, and best meaning like the most compelling, the most interesting, are usually the ones, I think, are like you almost empathize with them and you almost sympathize with them even though you know that they are the villain. There's something layered and complicated and relatable about that. And I'm saying this because I've noticed tonight during your conversation, you guys are both, and I love it, you're both like taking each of your mediums and sort of comparing your processes. And there's a lot of parallels that I find very interesting and relatable. And what I'm trying to say is that I think, I'm curious if that changes the way you would think about your contemporary supervillain now. And also, Tala, I think that in a way there could be a supervillain version in painting, because if you take like the idea that a good or interesting, compelling supervillain is layered and complicated, I think that paintings that offer questions rather than statements is, I think, the equivalent of that. That's
Also very interesting. I love what you're saying. I mean, I love what you're saying. I mean, I think what it brings to mind is like, what's most scary, is another way of asking that. And maybe what's most scary is when we find out that a place that we thought we were safe is actually very dangerous, or a person or a character or an image that, yeah. So if it was like a little baby,
Oh, that's very good. But it's also the reverse of that. That, like, what's the use? I mean, supervillains have had a use value, in propaganda, usually, right? Like so the use value of the supervillain, so we've kind of recently come to this, like, what's the word? The anti-hero, right? So, which is also a problem. Again, I come to Trump, but, right, so it's also had other use values that, I'm flawed. The Batman movie, right, that everybody was, during Bush years. I will do everything wrong, but I'm doing it for you, so love me secretly. So there's a political use value of the supervillain. So that we have to be wary of, right? That it's great to see the supervillain in a way as in a way human, because everybody's flawed, and then you're not sort of. But it's also interesting to think about how then are we allowing many flawed things in places where we shouldn't accept them. It's yeah. You were going to say, yes, the gentleman. Sorry.
in terms of supervillain, the Joker movie was a good example of what you were just saying a second ago. Yeah. My question is for Tala. I have to follow up to what you said about painting versus words. I love a lot of things that are written about your work, and especially here today, it's unbelievable how good they are. And my question is, what percentage of this is based on your writing? I don't mean writing, formal writing, maybe an email, text, or something to some curator or something. Or what percentage is made up by the art world and what percentage really are your words? What would you say?
So, didactics, texts in museums have been a point of a lot of discussion and thought in, I think, recent years, more so than previously in museums, where things were taken for granted. We're really thinking about them now, which is great. I've had the most amazing experience with MoCA, with the text, and you're not the first one that comments on the quality of them. I had very little to do with it. I was extremely lucky to have two curators, Ali Sabatnik and Rebecca Warren, who are both here, who spent so much time with the work and who understood it and who engaged with it in such a deep way, and they both wrote about it extensively. Now, they wrote didactics, they wrote texts that we don't even see because we didn't have enough space. So what you see is like a fragment of the time that they had put in. And it also reflects their expertise and their understanding of painting and artworks in general. And they just asked me once to look at it to make sure there's no, maybe I had like two things that I took out about something Iran, or maybe, I don't know.
In general, you don't write too much about your work? Or
I definitely like to make sure, well, if somebody's writing a review or something, obviously I have nothing to do, I can't say anything. But if it's something that I have some control over, like a gallery or somebody else, I do like to look at it and make sure that I'd sort of, a lot of times people want to, I always tell people, don't make judging as, like, don't say the scary painting, because it's not scary for everybody. That's just a personal, so don't judge it for the viewer. So I always try to sort of take back language that's judging, defining work already with a flavor in mind. So we abstain from that and try to leave it as open as possible with just small definitions of what's happening in the work, perhaps. And then, of course, and some other things, yeah.
Can I ask just another quick question? The word influence is a terrible word, but I'm not going to ask that question. I'm going to ask you, were you at all influenced by certain cartoonists or illustrators, growing up, or
So in Iran, we had this comic book for adults called Golaga, which my uncle got a lot, and I didn't understand it, but he laughed so much, and the fact that he got his attention, got my attention, I grew up with that. I think my generation is a generation of Bugs Bunny, Looney Tunes, Pink Panther. I think we grew up with those jokes, we grew up with those formal things. Later, as an adult, I've become really interested in like Eisler or Eisenman. I'm so sorry. It's an American cartoonist from the 20s. Well, I forget his name. I'm so sorry.
Eisenman, yeah.
Thank you, Eisner. Exactly. See, Rebecca Warren, everybody. So I kind of educated myself later into my practice. And of course, Slavs and Tatars exposed this amazing collection of not comic books, but what do you call them? Sort of, books for the public that were printed in the 19s in Azerbaijan area, which were quite important for the revolution that happened then. So these images existed 120 years ago. That I came to them from the Slavs and Tatars work, but I hadn't until then. So to your question, I think we also receive a lot of things without knowing that we're receiving them. And yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Of course. We have some more.
Another question? Thank you. I also see, I don't know if you saw that or not, but the story of me and my dad, قصه های من و بابام.
No, I didn't.
Oh, I really,
Please send it to
I'll
me.
show it to you. It really like reminds me a lot of men in your work, you know, but spaces. But my question is, it's just kind of like a battle in my personal mind, and it just came to me right now. As a curator, as a creative person that you're making the content, how much do you think, like, you know, you're observing and you're seeing all these harshness and villains and all these things, and you put it in your paper or a canvas, and do you think that would kind of like encourage the language of the violence, you know, like, I don't know, like, I got into meditation and keeps talking about like how love is important, you know, we talk about love, compassion, like, don't we need to focus more on the love, or like showing what the world around us look like, actually, you know, like, I would like to hear your answer about, yeah, as a curator, do you think you would encourage this, or, you know, I don't know, or is it better to do that or this?
Great question. So I think for me, the biggest cause for violence is deprivation, is oppressing your feelings. Then you'll erupt. So if you're not going to allow space for people to just have their feelings, whatever they're, the spectrum, that creates the actual, like, violence. So so the idea of you know, meditation is fantastic, right? But the idea that only meditation is the way, you know, whenever it becomes the only answer, is the beginning of deprivation of whatever else you might have needed another night or another hour. I don't know. I mean, you know, when kids have a tantrum, the thing is just let them have a tantrum. You try to stop it, they have a bigger tantrum. Just let them have their feelings. So that's what I have to say about that.
I did an interview last week with someone for a journal, and her first question was, you know, you write about a lot of dark and disgusting things, and a lot of people like to talk about how you do that. Do you feel ashamed? And I was like, that's the first question. I was like, you know, if I do feel ashamed, I'm not allowing myself to really experience the shame. And when you were asking that question, I felt ashamed, because what you're suggesting is like, this is like the opposite of what I do. And, you know, if I was, I like, you know, the way that I can justify it within, like, to myself, when I feel badly, when I feel like, oh, you know, creating a spectacle and storytelling of these negative attributes of human beings is contributing to darkness, and I should stop doing that. What I say is, what I tell myself is like, no, like, if everyone was just saying that everything was okay all the time, everybody would feel crazy, you know? So I think, you know, I don't think that I'm of use in that way. I don't think I'd be good at that. But I love the question.
I mean, yeah, because like I personally, it's like sometimes I make work that I can't look at it myself. Like your work has this like, you know, the caricature, or, you know, the tans in it, you know, the But yeah, like sometimes I make where it's like, this is harsh. Like, I don't want to see it. Who wants to see it? You know, who wants to look at it? So it's kind of like a battle that is like, should I go this way, that way? But I guess it's interesting to your answers. Let it go. Let it get out.
Well, I love that, though, what you said about, like, if everyone says everything's okay, you go around and think it's crazy. Yeah. This is what's happening right now in Iran. The government is like, everything's okay. Yeah. We're like, no, it isn't. You know? Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. Sorry, just a quick question. You both create characters and you both create conflict. Is there ever a point within the creation of it where you keep it so abstract that it doesn't become real? Because if it becomes real, then it may be something that ultimately affects you. Do you guys ever do that with your characters or with your paintings?
I try not to. I try to, like, really feel the, you know, and probably to an exaggerated extent, the magnitude of whatever is happening on the page. So, no. But that doesn't mean that I don't try not to suffer from it, you know? I mean, I think it's a little, for me, it's a little bit like method acting with like a really common safe word, like and, you know? Or I'm like, so and that's too much. And I can get up and walk away and, you know, talk to my dogs and pretend like that, you know, I didn't just kill someone, you know? And then I can sit back down and get back into it. So, but in order to write effectively, it can't be an abstraction. Do you know what I'm saying?
Entirely different answer for me. It's entirely abstracted. Like, I can't personify any of the characters at all. Otherwise, I couldn't paint them. They'd be too real. And so to paint them, to have to think about them and just like to draw them, they just have to be totally formal at some point. And not formal, nothing actually, just a line. And so the experience is, but I also think about it as method acting, oddly enough. But in that I'm, yeah, but in a very different way. Which I think is also the difference between having to stay in it again that long and having to think about it in terms of the material of painting. If I may, before we all depart, it's a mixed audience, some Iranians, some not Iranians. If you can just hold your empathetic attention to what's happening, because we all have so many things. I mean, what has been the last month? Who hasn't been just in pain in some way or form or another, right? We've all experienced so much, I'm sure. But if you can hold it within the periphery of what's happening, then it'll make every government have to look at it in Europe, in America. It'll make the possibility of a total, which is happening, a total, my language, I paint because I have no words. But if you can keep your attention to it, it'll make all the difference.
Merci.
Thanks, Mocha. Thanks, Ottessa.